This episode of the Troxel Podcast is made possible with support from ArchIT. Are you tired of standard IT services that miss the mark? Choose ArchIT for specialized, proactive IT management, BIM support, and robust data security tailored for architects. Whether you're a team of 10 or a growing firm of 50 plus, ArchIT understands the architecture industry and will empower your unique creative vision to enable you to do your best work. Embrace a technology team that enhances, not hinders, your design process. Visit getarchit.com for your free IT assessment and start transforming your firm and your tech experience today. That's getarchit.com. Welcome back to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel. And once again, if you are a regular listener and are enjoying these episodes, please subscribe on both YouTube and in your preferred podcast app to let me know that you're a fan of the show. Being a subscriber, which is completely free, directly influences two things, which are my ability to attract sponsors that help keep the show going and my ability to attract high-profile guests, which is great for you and our industry. So if you haven't subscribed, I encourage you to do so. As I mentioned, it's free, and it's a great way to support what I'm doing here. Your support is incredibly valuable for the sustainability of the show, and I deeply appreciate it. In this episode, I welcome Kean Walmsley. Kean is a software architect and senior manager focused on the research area of human-centric building design. In this episode, we discuss Kean's background both in computing and his career journey at Autodesk, where he's a well-known figure because of, well, his work there, and because of his long-running blog at keanw.com, and his talks and contributions at various AEC tech conferences, including Autodesk University, where I recently caught up with him. We also talk about the development and applications of the VASA toolkit for Dynamo, the impact of AR and XR in the AEC industry, the significance of real-time feedback during the design process, and so much more. Of course, this was a fantastic conversation with Kean, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. And so now, without further ado, I bring you Kean Walmsley. I'm joined today by Kean Walmsley, and I am very happy to have you on the show. And I've been following you for a long time. Stalking, lurking, I don't know what the right word is, but you have a great blog, and obviously you've been with Autodesk for quite a while. And you just recently attended the hackathon that happened in Zurich. Maybe before we jump into your story, how was that for you? And what kind of things did you see there?
Yeah, I mean, it was fun. I always loved the AC Hackathon events. You know, it's just amazing to see people come together and trying to solve the industry problems. I was only really there on the Friday. I already had a kind of personal commitments during the weekend, so I just came in for the Friday talks. They were mostly around open source technologies, and then the kickoff of the hackathon itself. But I found it very interesting. It was really I actually was kind of surprised at the number of people that I knew there and had the chance to catch up with some sort of unexpected folk that I've met over the years, and also some people that I've been in contact with but had never met in person. So it was very good. Yeah, but you know, short and sweet. I was only there for I was there for 5 hours or something, but still, it was not for the full weekend.
It's great that you're just close to that. I mean, that's the limiting factor, I think, so often for hackathons, right? It is that because they are so great in person, you want to be collaborating closely with your teammates on the hacks. And I mean, remote is one thing when it comes to that, but you being within a couple of hours of Zurich is incredible. And reading your bio, you've been all over the world, it sounds like. And so I'm really interested in your story. And I know you're in Switzerland now, correct? And we saw each other in Vegas at AU. And so you're traveling a lot, maybe, but you've also been all over the place with what you've been working on and your trajectory. So maybe take us back, tell us a story about what your experience has been.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'd be happy to. I don't, just to say though, I don't travel as much as I used to now, which is quite nice. I think COVID was good for that in the sense that
settling things down.
Yeah, and it's picked up. It's
right.
certainly picked up, of course, since then, but it's not as bad as it was before. But yeah, so my background, I mean, going back far enough, I mean, yeah, maybe we go all the way back, but I mean, I growing up, I was always interested in computers, and so this was in the I was born in the I can suppose we can say mid-70s, but early to mid-70s. First computer was a TRS-80 Model 3, but also had the more sort of entertainment focused, home PCs, ZX Spectrum, etc. Just fascinated by computing technology from an early age. I used to, and actually, the memory that I have that kind of maybe that I think back to, which sort of, I can see how my early career sort of fed from that in some way was like typing in lots of programs from magazines, right? Because that was just the
copy and line for line,
line, character by character, etc.
Right.
And there was a bug in one that I debugged, and it was like this moment where I was like, wow,
nice.
I wasn't yet coding, but I figured out
what
wasn't working. And that was like this kind of aha moment where I was like, this was really interesting, right? And then
I just want to pause because this is such a fun piece of your history. I started with the Apple IIe. We had Apple IIs and Apple IIIs in school, right? But my dad got an Apple IIe and learning kind of basic programming, and he was going through the process of learning it, and he would show me, and I wasn't very interested. I was interested, but I wasn't actually doing it. Print screen, go to line, and just. It was really, really simple stuff. And then I ended up buying my own computer, which was a Commodore 64, and I bought it at Toys R Us, right? Like that's where they sold the Commodore. That was one of the outlets, because back then computer stores there maybe was like Newegg computers. I don't think there wasn't many options back then, right? I'm not even sure where he bought the Apple IIe, but it was like you getting a book on programming games, copying it character by character, and hoping you didn't mess something up. And if you did, it was like, oh man, now I have to forensically go back. And I don't know if it's too different than programming today still, but obviously GPT, Copilot, and things have really changed the game when it comes to writing code. But anyway, that was a fun aside, because when you're talking about Atari, and it's just like, it just brought me back, because that's when we started our journey on computing. I mean, it was formative.
Yeah. And yeah, it's interesting, because even that is, talk about Copilot and things like that, but just like being able to copy and paste text into, from one environment into another was huge. Instead of I'll talk a bit about that as my first job in an engineering office, which is kind of interesting, which I'll come back to. But actually on the Commodore 64 side of things, that was an awesome machine. I never had one growing up, but I did kind of discover them a bit during COVID, in the sense I went online on the Swiss version of eBay, and I managed to pick up a Commodore 64 with 300 floppy disks. Nice. and a functioning floppy drive. And so one of the things I did,
is enormous, right? The floppy drive is
it wasn't like a proper 8-inch. It was like 5 1/4, but it was deep. It was big. Sure.
Yes, that's what I mean. It was like a shoebox size. And it was a 5 1/4 floppy, but it was an enormous physical space. It was like almost as big as the Commodore itself, right? I mean, just going in the other direction. Yeah,
exactly. So actually, I ended up doing a little YouTube series on my channel called Floppy Fridays, where basically every Friday I'd take some random floppy disks and try and load them and see what happened. And a lot of them were kind of hit or miss, but it kept me, I did 64 episodes during the pandemic, because it felt like a good number, right? So, and it was every Friday, including, the holidays. So it was literally, 52 plus the remaining 12.
Nice.
But yeah, by the time I was done, I learned a lot about the platform called the Commodore 64 platform. I really had a lot of fun. But yeah, that might be something to look at when you have a few, bored moments. But yeah, my first job in an engineering office was when I was, I guess I must have been 15 or 16, but around that age, I was still at school, and they needed somebody, and they were paying, they're paying £2 an hour, or maybe it's £4 an hour, but it was like a small amount of money. Back then it seemed huge.
It was everything, right?
Well, it was freedom.
Right.
But then can you put a price on that? But it was, my first job was to actually take old engineering calculation programs that were running on a PET machine and type them into a PC, because they just got a number of 286s actually then. And they wanted to effectively transfer these basic programs from PET Basic into GW Basic. So there was a very modest amount of rework needed, but basically it was just data entry. It was just typing. But yeah, that was actually fun, because within that drawing office, then they got AutoCAD. So they got 3 seats of AutoCAD, and they realized that they couldn't really do what they wanted to out of the box with it. So they had me, take a look at the Autolist manual and figure out how I could actually create some customizations for the drawing office to make them more efficient. It was a plastic vessel manufacturer that was effectively creating pressure vessels, etc. So there was a lot of 2D plans, elevations of nozzles and flanges and things like that. So to go in and essentially clip the nozzle so that it would join appropriately the point on the on the roof of this vessel, etc. So yeah, it was really there's a lot of geometry, a lot of fun problems figuring out how to do that stuff in Autolist. They ended up getting a third party or an independent package in addition to AutoCAD that would do 2D constraints, and so that was a product called Dimension N. So it was an early geometric package that allowed you to set up an overall drawing and then configure it. And I was really kind of pushing the boundaries on that package. I was constantly on the phone with the folks over in Peterborough. So this is about 35, 40 miles away from where I grew up. Trying to figure out whether what I was doing was the right way to do things and how I could, and that actually led over time to me getting a job for them as well. So I went in while still at university. I was studying computer science at university at the time. And I went in and helped document one of the packages that they were developing. I also that was actually my first trip to Switzerland for them. I went to the Swiss Railways to demo some software for the Swiss Railways in Lausanne. So that was actually really fun to do that, even as a student still, and speaking French for them as well, which was also pretty wild to think about back then. Because when I was studying, I guess, in a nutshell, my interests as a young man were with computers and speaking French. So in the UK, we have A levels. So we, I think still now, but we sort of filter down to a very small set of subjects, even at the age of 16, right? So I was doing computer science, maths, and French at that point from 16 to 18. And when I went to university, I chose the university really based on the ability to do an exchange year in France as part of the program.
Wow.
So
nice.
That was always my goal, was to work for a software company in a French-speaking country, which I always thought was France at the time, because, why not? But then I discovered Switzerland, and I realized that actually French-speaking Switzerland was the place for me.
Wow, how cool!
Yeah.
How
So
cool.
then, and it was really fun, because then while I was still at university, I was applying for jobs all over the place, and it wasn't that I wanted to go into the CAD industry at all. I mean, I'd had some experience, relatively low level experience with AutoCAD and with other packages, but I was, applying for any sort of computing related job, even some management consulting jobs. I mean, my life would be very different if I'd got one of those. But I ended up, getting an email in my I was in my fourth year, so wrapping up my studies in the UK, and it was my future boss who emailed me and said, "Well, I was just speaking to your former boss at this smaller software company. I'm building a team that is going to be essentially a European developer support team. So we would, the people in the team would be answering technical problems, so talking back to the debugging, magazine listings, but also, giving training around our programming interfaces, speaking at conferences and seminars, and, so there'd be quite a lot of travel, quite a lot of interaction with people." And by that point, I kind of realized that my destiny was not necessarily to be a heads down coder, just doing development on one feature or even one particular area, that I wanted more variety. And I also wanted that human connection. So I was like, sign me up. When can I start? Kind of thing. Well, obviously then had to go for an interview. And my first round interview was in the UK in our office in Guildford at the time. So this would have been in June or July of 1995. But the second round interview was in Switzerland because that's where he was based. And he told me, when we were talking about logistics, he said, "Don't bring a big suitcase." And I said, "Okay, well, I'm only coming overnight, but I won't." And sure enough, it's because he picked me up from the train station in his little Miata sports car and didn't really have space for me to put a big bag in the trunk. And he drove me down to the Bolac Hotel, which is on the lake front. And, and that first night before the interview, I was kind of left to my own devices. And I remember walking down by the lake, kind of all nervous energy. And I just sat there and saw this kind of dry thunderstorm over the Alps, the other side of the lake. And I just said, "Oh, this is where I want to be." And so I got the job in the UK originally. I mean, so the job was in the UK, despite the fact that by that point I decided I wanted to be in Switzerland. And it took me maybe 2.5 years or 2 years to convince my boss that he'd be better off moving me across to Switzerland.
He'd be better off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's
you would be a better employee if you were there.
Well, that's right. Well, anyway, I was really pushing hard. So, and that's what happened. I moved to Switzerland in February, March of 1998. And I thought that would probably be it. But then at some point along my journey, and by this point, I'd switched across to use some slightly different product, working with different products. So originally, when I joined Autodesk, it was to support Work Center, which was a document management product, which at the time looks a lot like Vault does today. So you can think about Vault as being sort of a
interesting,
very different product, but it has very similar principles to Work Center. So I was supporting the API to Work Center, and then I sort of was working with AutoCAD as well. But over the years, I ended up doing GIS software, doing a lot of work with Architectural Desktop, which was my first kind of exposure to AEC software, I suppose, other than AutoCAD. Right. And so, yes, so then I was working in Switzerland, enjoying that a lot. And then an opportunity came up in the same team as the European team, but in the Americas. And actually the manager of the Americas team was leaving. So I was asked to, would I be interested in applying? And so I did, along with a few other folks, and I ended up getting the position. And then, meeting my girlfriend around the same time, which was strange timing. So she was also working for Autodesk. She was a student working for Autodesk as a temp job type thing. We met and started going out, and at some point I said, "Well, I've got this job in the US. I know we haven't been together very long, but you want to come? And so she was like, yeah, sure, let's try. And so she just came with one backpack ready to leave at any moment should things not work out. And we kind of moved across together.
Travel light so you could escape. Yeah.
Exactly.
If you need, right.
Because you never know. Anyway, so that was early in our relationship relatively. And it was also a very interesting time to move to the US. Because it was in 2000, must have been in the late summer. Yeah, towards the end, September, October time, actually, in year 2000, which you will remember very well as the time that George W. Bush just won the election. So that was kind of a very interesting time to move to the Bay Area in particular. And then, of course, it was also the tail end of the dot-com boom. So hiring was a disaster. I had to build this team, or rebuild this team from people who'd left, etc. And so recruiting was really challenging, which was my first taste of that particular challenge overall. And it set me in good stead for later years, but it was not easy. And then September the 11th happened, of course. And yeah, things for us went very strange, especially being French speakers, even though it's not my first language. It is my wife's first language. She's also fluent in English, and we're mostly speaking English. But the sort of I don't know if you will remember the whole sort of freedom fries thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yep, I remember.
Right, the whole, and it's not like we necessarily felt this sort of less welcome in the Bay Area.
Yeah,
but it was a strange time to be in the US generally, I would say.
Yeah,
and it kind of made us realize that for us it wasn't the place that we wanted to start a family. So we did get married in the US in November of 2001, so not long after 9/11, but actually at Autodesk University. So just a few days before, in fact, because we were going to be there anyway. For AU 2001.
And where was that? Was that in Vegas?
Yeah, we got married in Vegas by Elvis.
All right.
Which for us is cute and kitsch, whereas I think for most Americans it's a little trashy. But
what's funny is you're like, I don't think that the U.S. is the place for us to start the family, but we're doing this wedding thing with Elvis.
Yes, exactly. Well, it's yeah, I know that when you say it like that, it does seem a little bit incongruent. I get it.
I love it. But it's a good story, man.
But it's just how it happened. Anyway, so we got married, and then at that point, I was kind of putting out the feelers within Autodesk to see whether there are opportunities else inside the company that I could, move into, but back in Europe effectively. So, and so I was really happy that somebody in our consulting division sort of came to me and said, "Oh, I heard you're looking to move back to Europe." And he was like the head of the European consulting team. So I thought, okay, it's perfect. I'm going to get a job in Europe. No problem. He actually said, well, the good news is I've got an opportunity for you. The less good news, depending on where you want to be, is that I've now got a global role and I'd really like you to go to India to set up a development team for my organization.
Wow.
And well, it is, it came as a little bit of a surprise. But at the same time, I said, well, where in India? And he says, oh, Bangalore. And I said, well, my mum is actually from Bangalore. I had family in Bangalore, like my grandmother and uncles and aunts.
Incredible. Yeah.
So I was like, you know what? So I talked about it with my wife and they said, well, if you go for 2 years, normally with these kind of deals, first of all, it's an expat deal. So the money was attractive. It was actually more than I was getting in the US and the costs would be lower, of course. But they also said normally they'd move me back to the US afterwards. That would be the deal. But I sort of said, well, if you change it so that you can move me anywhere in the world afterwards, with no guarantee of a job, but just to relocate me, then yeah, okay, maybe we can talk more about it, because our intention is not to come back to the US afterwards.
Yeah. Right.
And so that's kind of how it went down. We ended up going to Bangalore in I think October of 2003 is when we moved, pretty much. And so there I was helping set up a team that could deliver consulting projects for Autodesk worldwide from India. So this was kind of the early days of IT offshoring, I suppose. There was that kind of wave that was hitting. There's a big boom around
right,
hiring people in much the same way as hiring people in the Bay Area had been challenging. Hiring people in Bangalore at that time was super challenging. So that was really quite interesting as well.
Just because there was so much demand at that time. I mean, same thing with the .com boom. You didn't say bust, you said boom, right? So I assume it's a supply and demand issue where talent is going to the highest bidder, and yeah, I can imagine.
Exactly. So it was really that. It was like and nobody wanted to come and work well, at least in the Bay Area at the time, like nobody wanted to go and work for a bricks and mortar software company that was founded in the 80s. Everybody wanted to go
internet
into
company
pets.com or whatever. I don't know, whatever the thing was at the time. So, in India it's slightly different. I mean, Autodesk remained a reasonably attractive, target for people who are looking to get a job, but at the same, not really, because it was also quite a flat sort of hierarchy within Autodesk. It's always been that way in many ways. And one of the things that we found with people wanting to do a job, work for an employer, a multinational employer, they were looking for much more hierarchy and the ability to progress, regularly have a job change or, title change, which is not necessarily what's important or what's important inside Autodesk. It's really that at all. It's really about, yes, you look at compensation, you look at the work you're doing. You don't really look at the title that somebody's given you. But so that's where we had to adapt a little bit to the local market and sort of find ways to sort of be attractive as an employer to people who wanted to come to us. The other kind of wrinkle to that whole story in many ways is that we arrived in India and found out that we were expecting our first child. So my wife was pregnant, and I just signed a 2-year contract to do this job. And we're like, well, what do we do? Do we go back to the UK? Well, go somewhere else, go back to Switzerland, go to the UK, whatever. Or do we sort of stay and go all in and have the baby in India? And I kind of said, well, if you want to have the baby in Europe, we can certainly go back and do that. But I did feel this, commitment. I'd made a commitment for 2 years, and I said, well, I can come back regularly, but we won't be together all the time. That's just, that's not realistic. I can't, at the time, there's no way I could have done the job from Europe. I really needed to be there in Bangalore. So we made the decision to look for an apartment that was really close to the office, within walking distance, so they didn't have to deal with, I could come back really quickly if I needed to. We looked at hospitals and found one that worked for us, and decided to have the baby in India, which was kind of a big deal. It was, I had local support, of course, with family, so that helped as well, but it was still kind of a challenging period.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
It just sounds like it's going all over the place. Like you literally don't know where you're going to be in 2 years because of this. You've bounced around already so much in this story. It's incredible.
Yeah, I had a clue though. I knew I wanted to go back to Switzerland afterwards, really. Yeah.
You send another email to your boss and
there you go. By that point he'd left, so it was a different boss at that point. But I was kind of lucky in the sense, well, that's also the good thing about being on a time limited kind of engagement like that, is you can set an expectation of what your intentions are and look for opportunities back in Europe. So I, at the time then, was able to sort of, kind of figure out what the next move would be. And then by the time I was about to finish the 2 years, I was kind of in a global role at that point, because there'd been a restructuring, and I was, I was in our developer network organization. I'd actually been part of that all the way through, but it was a bit complicated, but we were part of consulting for a time. And so while, the team I had was working on consulting projects, they were also providing developer support. So there was still that kind of continuity. But yeah, so my boss, and you may have come across Jim Quancy over the years anyway. No, maybe not. Okay. Well, he's the senior director of our developer network inside Autodesk, and he's soon to be retiring actually. But he was the person I was reporting to at the time, and I became a senior manager with a worldwide responsibility. And then moving back to Switzerland was straightforward to justify at that point. So that's what we did. I moved back in 2006, and I was at that point, having managed a team in the Americas and a team in Asia, I was now managing, 20 to 30 people in a worldwide. So I then had teams all over the place, which was really fun. Traveling to Japan and China, etc. Yeah, so that was the trajectory in terms of my offices, the end I ended up working in. And then so by that point I was back in Switzerland, and we, had a couple more kids. And so increasingly less likely to want to carry on traveling really. So yeah.
That's great. And so you've did this giant loop around the world and got back to the place where you really felt like this was where you wanted your roots to be. And that's, and just to speak to your last part there, like it's less likely to uproot when you're actually putting those roots in. And it just sounds like a perfect place for you. That's, my wife and I were looking for something similar. It was just like, we were done with being in LA. We were just completely done with it. And I don't think I've told this story before, but one night we were in the midst of selling our house, listing it, doing the photography, staging everything, and doing all the things that you do. And I was just like, wondering, am I actually making the right decision? I'm just I need to do a check here, because I think once you kind of make a choice and then you start getting, the snowball gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it's like, you're less likely to do a check and see, because you're already on the path. And so I was like, oh, I'm going to I walked outside at midnight into this beautiful backyard landscape that we had just completed to enjoy. It was right after COVID, and it was one of those things where it's like, we did this project so that we could enjoy our space in the backyard, and built this wonderful deck and a fire pit and outdoor dining and all this. And I sat there and I just was like contemplating this. And then I heard the helicopters, and I heard the traffic, and I heard sirens, and I heard the train, and I heard like all of these, just the noise pollution alone. It was so convincing to me at that moment that I was absolutely making the right choice, because we hadn't even decided really where we were going to end up, but we knew it had to be different than this. And I think coming up as a designer in architecture, I work with clients throughout the decades who always wanted something that was the complete opposite of what they had. They didn't know what that was, but they knew it wasn't what they had. And so if they had a room with no windows, they wanted a room that was all glass. If they had a room with a low ceiling, they wanted a really high ceiling. And that was how I felt in that moment. It was like, I know I don't want this. I knew I wanted to get more connected to nature. I wanted to be close to trails. I wanted clean air. I knew I wanted no noise. I wanted dark skies, all of these things. And so we had an idea of where we were going, but it was that moment that like really sealed it for me. And I think that is such interesting kind of things that we have to also juggle in our professional lives, right? Is the family, the roots, where you're going to put your roots down. And there's all of these parts of us that are a part of that equation, and navigating all that. Like there's no playbook for any of that. So I'm appreciative to you for telling this story, because I think it is a big part of what everybody deals with. And even though this is a podcast about tech and AEC, like we have to acknowledge that there's these other things out there. And I mean, a big reason why I do this podcast is because when I was starting a digital practice at a firm that only had IT up to that point, I mean, there was no playbook. And that's why I've done this, right? It's like to give people the tools to not only just hear about how other people are dealing with things, but how to implement things. But also now I think I'm very interested in broadening the reach of the types of information and stories that we tell on this podcast to make it more whole. I mean, that to me is, and so I appreciate you telling that story because it was a beautiful story, and I'm really jealous of where you are. I mean, I've seen the Alps, right? Like I've seen your skiing trips that you've posted a couple of pictures of here and there, and it's an incredible location, and I can see why you were so drawn to it.
Yeah, I mean, it is a lovely place to live, and and it has to be said that I got some advice, and again from Jim. So Jim Walmsley, he gave some interesting advice quite early on in my career, and that's, which I've kind of taken to heart to some degree, but he sort of says, figure out where you want to live in the world and move there.
Mm-hmm.
Don't worry about work. Don't worry about whatever else, just, that stuff takes care of itself. And I think that's increasingly true now, right?
Yeah.
In the sort of more online post-COVID world that you can find a way.
I think that
sort
is
of environment is really important.
The story that you started with, and like you would get on the phone and you would talk to the software support, right? There was no internet when you were trying to figure out how to push the limits of the CAD package, right? And now look where we are, right? Over that 25 years, it's absolutely incredible. And to your point, I think a lot of times we flip that. We say we have to have that figured out before we go, or else we can't go. And the advice that was given to you was go, and the other stuff will fall into place. I think that's a nice perspective to have, and it runs antithetical to what a lot of people think or hear from the people they're asking.
Yeah.
This episode is made possible with support from AVAIL. In a world where precision meets creativity, where every line drawn holds the power to innovate, people like you are shaping the future. But let's face it, in the realm of design, the unknown is your least favorite companion. You've been stranded on the island of inefficient software, lost in the fog of endless searching for the right content. It's time to embark on a new journey, a journey to clarity, efficiency, and design excellence. It's time to get off that island and away from the unknown. Introducing AVAIL, the beacon in your design odyssey. Say goodbye to the daunting 10 to 20 minutes wasted per search, the costly interruptions in your creative flow. With AVAIL, your team will zip through content discovery, focusing more on designing and less on searching. Imagine a world where you can stop constantly fighting the costly fires caused by pulling content from past projects, building from scratch, or relying on personal libraries. AVAIL isn't just a tool, it's a revolution for AECO firms. Organize, manage, and navigate your project information with a leader that's proven in reliability, relatability, and success. Join the ranks of the top AECO firms who've already chosen AVAIL. In just 30 days, you could deploy AVAIL and witness a dramatic reduction in costly design errors. Whether it's your first CMS or you're considering a switch, there's someone you should meet. Will Rouse, your guide to all things AVAIL. Schedule an appointment and explore AVAIL's capabilities, onboarding programs, and professional services. Don't let your designs be clouded by inefficiency. Clear skies are just a click away. Go to getavail.com/stranded and book a meeting with Will to start your AVAIL journey today. AVAIL, where your best design is just a search away. My thanks to AVAIL for supporting this episode of the Troxel Podcast. And now, let's get back to the conversation.
So you have no regrets about moving to Oregon?
Well, it's only been a year, right? But no, in this year, it's been incredible, and incredible from a sense of like I can't see my neighbors, and not that my wife is much more private than I am. I have a podcast that goes out to a global audience, right? And so, but at the same time, it's like we have our space and we have the dark skies and we don't have the noise pollution and we have amazing air quality. And I like to go mountain bike riding and I have incredible world-class trails here. So it's been an amazing experience so far, and I'm proud to call myself an Oregonian. And what's funny is there's a lot of ex-Californians here, and so I don't feel too out of place, because we thought, what's that going to be like? There's definitely places in the U.S. that are like, go home, Californians, stop ruining our state. And I would say like 95% of the people that I talk to who have been here for a while now came from California. So,
oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of ex-Californians here. So,
just within Autodesk, I know a number of people who've moved up from San Francisco or the Bay Area generally to Portland. We have a big office there now. So, and even before then, when we had an office in Tualatin, that was or Lake Oswego after that. The people would often sort of go up there for the quality of life perspective, and to just get bigger place, but also just be, as you say, connected to nature in that way.
Yeah. I've interviewed Gabe Paez, who is out of Portland, who was on the XR team and obviously was the founder of The Wild. And there's actually an Autodesk podcast host. He lives here. And so we've gotten together a couple times too, which is fantastic. So it is interesting to be able to build your network internationally, but then still find these close relationships happening because of that it's just like kind of reversed funnel, right? It's really interesting. One of my old students, when I used to teach at the university in Southern California, lives less than a mile away from me. He's an architect, right? And it's like, how did that happen? Like we found each other on Instagram. He posted a photo. I'm like, that looks like this valley, and he's like, it is. Where are you? And it's just one of those serendipitous things that I find that so interesting, how those things happen. I have no idea how they happen, but it's so interesting that they do.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think there is that aspect of the, being connected more globally, of course, is just sort of surfacing these local connections that prove to be really valuable that you wouldn't otherwise know.
So let's talk about what you're doing now. And I know I got to attend your class on voxels and Minecraft. Those were kind of the big topics that, or I'll just say those were the kind of the defining characteristics of your talk. And you're working a lot with, what I would see is like you get to play around. That's what it seems like to me. So you're doing things that are categorized under research, but I think you're having the time of your life playing around. So maybe you can definitely explain it a lot better than I can, but I think it's kind of fascinating the types of projects that you get to work on within Autodesk. So take it from there and tell us kind of what's been going on in your world.
Yeah, so it's an interesting, and even that's a bit of progression. So sort of, back when, and actually it's interesting, a lot of the explorations that I've done over the years have ended up being driven by the blog, which was interesting. So when I first started it, so that was, and actually it sort of connects quite well with the story of how we ended up in Switzerland. And around that time, as I said, I'd become kind of a senior manager within the developer network team, and we were exploring ways to grow the developer network and to give people better information. And one of the things that came up in a brainstorming was the idea of starting a developer blog. So back at that time, I think there was a couple of Autodesk blogs. Maybe Sean Hurley had started Between the Lines, and another Oregonian. So he had started Between the Lines, and it was proven to be super successful with our user base and our customers. And so we said, well, we're not sure that there's enough of a market or interest for us to start a developer blog, but let's look at starting one that's based on developing with AutoCAD. And at the time, the .NET interface to AutoCAD was under-documented and was super interesting and powerful, but there just wasn't enough information about how to use it. So we said, well, let's try this. And I've actually volunteered to do so because I love to write, and I'd already had some experience of blogging when I was in India. I actually did an internal blog about my living in India and the challenges that we had while we were there. I used to get a lot of really fun feedback from the sort of Indian community in the Bay Area, particularly, who used to just laugh at my fun.
Right.
Yeah, that is a bit of an anecdote, but I remember at the time, one of the fun ones was having to get a birth certificate for my son. Our son, who, when we wanted to travel for the first time outside of India, there was a whole process to follow in order to get it. And you had to go through all these, just amazing, dusty offices inside this sort of, old sort of empire, British Empire type building with where you had to go from one office to the next. So I created a flow chart sort of describing the process, but then also the shortcuts you could take and how much it cost in the bribes to speed up the process each time. I have to dig it out. I have it somewhere.
That's great.
But it was really kind of fun. So it's things like that I used to post. And so I had some experience blogging, and then I thought, well, let's try. So I started blogging in June or July of 2006. It was also, for me, having become a senior manager, I was feeling a little bit further away from technology and also from our customers. So for me, it was a good way to reconnect with the community, which has always been really important to me. And it ended up being quite successful. I mean, I think at some point, obviously the whole blogging, the blogosphere from Autodesk blogosphere sort of exploded from 2004 onwards. And I don't know how many blogs there are now, but at one point it was probably the third most visited Autodesk blog. I think it would not be as high ranked at this stage because of the shift in content over the years. And people still do come for a lot of my old content, but as my job has changed, I end up blogging less about technology and how to sort of use our products and APIs, and more about my, adventures or what I'm up to. So
you have to keep it fresh, though. You have to keep it interesting for you.
Right.
You go through those different shifts in what you're interested in putting out there. I used to have a YouTube mountain biking channel. I would love to post more videos to that, but it's one of those things where it's just like, I think that there is a lot of value in these little side hustles like this, right? Whether it's sanctioned by the mothership or not, because it ignites the curiosity in you, which then feeds back into the business. Ultimately, it makes you an interesting person who also, you have this direct line with an audience, and there's a feedback loop there, which also informs the work that you do. I think it's a really cool thing. Sorry to derail the
but that's a really insightful comment. I mean, I always felt that having this role and then showing a kind of a human face to this sort of what you don't want to be considered a big faceless corporation, right? But always has the risk of going in that direction, but sort of showing, giving a connection point for people, right? I think that was valuable, but it's very true that having that kind of unofficial feedback loop with people out in the real world is really valuable. Getting that validation or the just sort of that input that can feed into what you're doing is really important. So, I mean, the blog actually led me to exploring all sorts of technologies over the years, such as things like functional programming, things that were kind of emerging. The Kinect, I connected in the Kinect into AutoCAD quite early on when somebody had hacked it. I only remember in 2000, I think it must have been 2008 when the Kinect came out, and very early on somebody created a little DLL that allowed you to get data from it. So I kind of found a way to host that inside AutoCAD so that you could essentially use the Kinect sensor as a reality capture device, but also use it to detect gestures, so you could move your hands through space and draw inside the AutoCAD canvas. So that was kind of cool. And then so all sorts of fun experiments like that kind of paved my way to getting more connected with the CTO's office. And I had a really interesting time when Robert Aish joined the company back in the day. So Robert joined to build, at the time we were talking about D#, but it became Design Script, which is now obviously part of Dynamo. And this is essentially a language that allowed you to, create, designs inside Dynamo. But at the time, we were trying to integrate it inside AutoCAD. So the course of about 6 weeks. I did a very quick prototype with Robert just to sort of show the potential for having that kind of language integrated inside a tool like AutoCAD. And that led to other opportunities. Like I ended up moving into the AutoCAD team for a while as a software architect, which was really fun. Again, mostly, I was a software architect on our AutoCAD-based verticals that were mostly quite mature. So it wasn't like I kind of joke about it now in the sense I was a software architect for a number of products that didn't need a software architect. So I was mostly, it was mostly about keeping the wheels on the bus when there were changes inside the platform. You know, how would things happening inside AutoCAD, changes inside AutoCAD impact these vertical products? But it was very interesting. I enjoyed that time, and I continued to do my explorations with the blog until eventually in about 2016, I shifted across into research, and that became more of my sort of day job as well.
I have a selfish question. What year was it that AutoCAD came back to the Mac? Because it was on the Macintosh very early.
Yes.
And was it release 12 maybe that it went away? Maybe it was pretty far back because it was like a floating point thing. I remember there was just like, nope, we're not doing that anymore. And most people were on PCs at that point anyway, right? Especially in architecture.
I want to say that I don't know exactly when AutoCAD chose to, when the engineering team dropped support for the Mac, but I mean, it probably was a bit before support for DOS was dropped, and it would have been R13 was like the last version of AutoCAD that I remember that was on DOS, and so it would have been R14 was Windows only from then on until, and this is where it gets a bit tricky for me. Can't remember exactly what. I mean, I remember the process in I'd have to look it up, but I can't remember exactly. But it might have been around 2010 or 11.
I was going to say 2013 was my guess, but I don't know. I honestly, that was just, I don't know why that number sticks out. But I remember when it did, there was, I follow Anthony's blog at architosh.com, and several people who are obviously always tracking the Mac and AEC, and I've always been one of those people as well. But it's that was a big deal. I mean, and it was beautiful. I mean, to have a big 27-inch iMac screen or whatever running a really beautiful looking product AutoCAD that everybody was familiar with on the hardware that they wanted to run it on was a big deal for that to come back. That was
absolutely
cool.
And it was really, I mean, what's interesting about that was that I was more excited about the sort of re-architecture work that enabled that and the potential that came off that. And I'll sort of tell you a bit of let's do a potted history of the AutoCAD architecture. But so R13 was, so prior to R13, everything was not object based. It was, a lot of the code was written in C. It was rewritten, many parts of it were rewritten during the R13 timeframe to make this sort of more flexible object based framework where you could plug in new objects and allow, external developers could create their own custom objects that effectively extended the AutoCAD object set, and you could create, and it enabled all these various vertical applications that came on top of AutoCAD and the vertical based products. So everybody remembers R13 as being the worst release of AutoCAD ever, right? But for me, it was in many ways the most impactful. Like if we hadn't done it, Autodesk would not exist today. I can say that fairly safely.
Yeah.
So it enabled everything.
It's the product. Yeah.
But it just enabled all this growth into new markets. It enabled this whole vibrant developer community around the world to flesh out this ecosystem of products that was so important to our customers. So despite the fact it was painful for customers, it was like and it might have been executed differently. You could argue that it shouldn't have been released when it was. It could have taken a bit longer, but it was super important. So that was one of the refactors. Another one kind of came around the 2000 timeframe when we went from having single document AutoCAD to having multiple documents loadable, and so there was a whole kind of encapsulation process that allowed us to have, to unplug. We even had called it DWG Unplugged at the time, but unplug the engine that loaded DWG files. Although we had to stop because I think we got a cease and desist letter from MTV, if I remember correctly, because they didn't like the use of that particular term.
Well, yeah, people would definitely confuse those two things. I can see that. Yeah.
DWG Unplugged, I know, right? Became Object DBX. And so that was.
I mean, AutoCAD, Eric Clapton. Yeah, I can see.
Yeah,
that.
I mean, it's just so surreal. But ridiculous. I mean, that's where the inspiration came from. So what I can understand what the concerns might have been.
That was the problem. Is you let that be known that inspired
probably.
you.
Yeah.
Didn't like
well,
that.
not me personally, but the product managers. Anyway, so they renamed it. But anyway, so that was another important sort of step in the modularization of AutoCAD is to have this sort of separate component that could manage DWGs. But then when we went to the Mac, we had a process that was what was called at the time the big split. And this was not just the reading and writing of DWG, but almost all the commands that are south of the border in terms of the UX, the UI for it layer, would be encapsulated in a way that could be rebuilt across different platforms. And so this was a really arduous process. And they ended up having to go back. They're looking at code that, code from AutoCAD that existed prior to becoming Windows-centric. Because as soon as we went Windows-centric, all this Win32 crud kind of, Win32 API calls ended up coming into the code base. So they had to kind of purify it essentially and cleanse it from all these platform specific API calls. And then, but then eventually they ended up with this really beautiful code base that could be rebuilt for the Mac, could be run headless inside a terminal window on the server to do operations. So it's also driving a lot of the Autodesk platform services or Forge capabilities around design automation. And it could end up being sort of built into a package that can be loaded in the browser. So it enabled AutoCAD Web as well. So actually,
and is that when it made it onto the iPad as well?
I think so. Well, I you know what? I'm not, in terms of the timeline, I think they did have a different version of AutoCAD. They definitely had a different version of AutoCAD that was on iOS and, the iPad. Right now, I imagine that is using the same code base, but I don't actually know for sure what the situation is there. But definitely having this kind of re-architecture has led to support for all these different platforms. And then on each platform, they have their platform-specific UI, capabilities, then call into this core code base. So AutoCAD's become this like super resilient code base over the years that is, I mean, it's for me, it's quite miraculous that some code that was written in 1983 is still running inside Chrome or whatever inside your.
It's incredible to think about how hard it is to change the behavior of the user as well. So you talked about kind of this modularization and the ability to load multiple documents. There's probably still a lot of architects that just draw everything in one file, right? Like you've got the plans over here, you've got the elevations pulled off of those plans and all the different orientations, and you've got sections off to the right, and you've got the site plan up and to the left, and it's all in one file, right? And then they're still operating that way today. I mean, it's to pry those habits out of their, you will have to pry those habits out of their cold dead fingers, right? Because it's just the way that they do things. And this has always been something that I've been super interested in, which is how do you enable adoption of new features, new tools, new paradigms, new platforms when the way that I do it works for me. I know it. It's like in some ways, your identity is wrapped up in some of those things because the cost is too high to spend the time to learn the new way or to spend the money or whatever it is. We have so much tied up in our old files that we still need to get access to every once in a while and maybe get something out of or go back and revisit, because our projects take so long. Man, there's a lot of nuance and I don't know, to your point, like there's a lot of cruft built up in that's just inherent in the system that makes it very difficult to move forward for many people.
Yeah, and I mean, I see it myself. In my day-to-day work, tools come online, and I consider myself to be reasonably interested in adopting ways of working and workflows, but we all have our habits, and I totally understand that. So I think it's one of those things where and there's probably been studies around this that, this is by no means, truth, but it's the, what I sense is that you kind of have to have this probably order of magnitude improvement in your efficiency to be worth going to that next level, right? It's like you need some significant change. It can't just be, I don't think it can be half the time. Yeah,
I've heard 10x. It needs to be 10 times better to get somebody to pay attention. And then that first run experience needs to be pretty good, right? If it's a terrible first experience, but it's still 10 times better, I don't think it's going to happen, right? It's one of those things where there's multiple things that all have to be going in the right direction for it to even be a consideration. And it's still easy to kill. I mean, there's, especially early in that journey from one way of doing things to another way of doing things, it's very easy to kill.
Yeah. No, that resonates with my feeling as well about this. And I think that one thing that I'm happy about over the years is that, at least as a company, we have been able to maintain a set of products that work for the people who've been with us since the 80s, right? So, I think the AutoCAD team's done a really good job at that. Obviously, other products have come online since, and we haven't always kept every product that we've had, but there is a certain sort of core offering that remains attractive, and while having kind of new things come online as well. Yeah. But AutoCAD people still use it. And I don't, well, I mean, I don't look at it from a user perspective. I look at it more from an internal or architectural perspective. I'm very impressed with what that team has pulled off over the years. I mean, it's similar in some ways to Microsoft Office and what that team has been able to do, which is something quite similar around sort of refactoring their code base so that it can run across platforms, and then just keeping up-to-date mobile technology, various other. I mean, Microsoft is amazing what they've done with, the sort of 365 Copilot stuff as well, and how they're integrating AI. It's really an amazing company. But I'm anyway. So hats off to the AutoCAD team for that, at least. Yeah,
for sure. So now you're working at the class that I got to attend at AU. You were talking about Minecraft and voxels, and I thought that there was a lot of really interesting opportunities there. And the thing that I mentioned after I attended to you when we caught each other in the hall was this idea of kind of the intersection of VR, XR with the work that you're doing as a possibility for wayfinding inside of buildings, because the example that you were showing was like path of travel, using voxels to kind of determine path of travel through three-dimensional space in a digital environment, and mapping a path of travel and then being able to see it in space, on the computer. And then I was thinking, oh man, how great is it to have an AR headset or something where then that path could be transferred to my eyes and I could follow it to get somewhere. I could see, I used to do a lot of work with schools, and if you have an orientation for a student, it's like, where is the office that I need to get to in building 18F that's in some basement, who knows where that is, right? And it just seems to me like there's a lot of interesting applications to the research that you're doing there. And it's funny because you're tying it back to Minecraft, which I have a 17-year-old who loves Minecraft, loves it. Again, talks about the nuance of Minecraft, and it's completely lost on me because of I don't follow it. But at the same time, it's this incredible environment to make things, right? And that's what I love about it on his behalf, is that he's actually making things on the computer, not just consuming and not just playing. He is doing it through play, which I think is an important aspect, but it's a creation engine, right? And I think that that's what we're doing as architects as well. We're building these digital environments, and now you're looking at kind of an intersection of game, play slash building environment, right, which is based on cubes, and the work that architects are doing, and how those merge. I was really intrigued with your talk, and I would love it if you would kind of take the opportunity to give an overview of what you were talking about.
No, absolutely. So yes, I mean the class is really around a toolkit that we've built inside Autodesk Research called VASA, which is a voxel-based architectural space analysis. So it's really and think of it as a toolkit, and it's inside Dynamo, but we also have sort of versions that we run separately as well, where you can take a sort of 3D geometry, break it up into cubes, and it will analyze this space. Not necessarily cubes, actually. The voxels are often like long and thin for reasons, but you can look at that. For people who are interested, my AU talk explains a little bit more about this. But effectively, this toolkit will break up a building model and allow you to run certain spatial operations to understand how, human-centric it is. And I'll talk a little bit about that term, I suppose, when we see that term as well. But yes, how easy it is for somebody to get from one place to another, how much daylight they can get because they happen to have proximity to a window. We can start to analyze the space and to make sense of it and see how well adapted it is for its occupants.
And because it's voxels, it's inherently 3D, right? And I think I just want to put this out there early, is that a lot of the things that you're talking about, we are traditionally used to looking at in 2D representation, right? Daylight analyses, views, right? We're talking about isovists and path of travel. All of these things are usually on a set of PDFs or as imagery that we look at in 2D, but the bridge that you're building here is really taking that into the 3D environment.
Yeah, that's right. And actually the original sort of work that was done before VASA was in 2D. So we had a 2D version of it called Space Analysis, and it had those same capabilities. One of the interesting things about Space Analysis is that, and VASA as well, it is really based on this idea of sort of discretizing a space, breaking it up either into a grid in 2D or into a voxel grid in 3D. And then, performing operations on those. So there are definitely kind of, you could do the same thing using more geometric approaches like typically you do ray tracing or ray casting to check visibility for an isovist. So you draw a line, infinite line in a certain direction, and then you check to see whether it hits anything. Whereas breaking it up into a grid will allow you to have much more predictable performance for that particular resolution, especially if you're doing repeated operations. So that's one thing that we found with this 2D space analysis package. So it was Rhys Goldstein, my colleague in Toronto, who was really the mastermind behind both space analysis and VASA. But having done this work for space analysis, he really wanted to explore the third dimension and to see whether it was possible to do something similar for 3D, which is what led to VASA. But yes, having that capability in 3D and able to work on pretty much any model, we very often just load STL files in to work with and test it. Though obviously we can get the geometry more directly from Revit or Dynamo. But that's it just can break it up, and then you can start to do these analyses. And what's very interesting there is that resolution slider or that trade-off between accuracy and performance is really, it's up to you. If you want to do a really coarse voxel model, which is super quick to analyze, but the results aren't going to be quite as good because it's the approximation is poor, then you can. But if you want to dial up the precision and wait a bit longer because it's going to take a bit longer to calculate, then you can absolutely do that. So it's that kind of, you have that real freedom to choose what makes most sense. Do you want to just do something very quickly just to give an indication of how it works, or do you need to take a bit longer and do it with much greater accuracy?
And
so
this kind of visualization
really
tool gives you the ability to really understand three-dimensional environments and daylighting as an example, right? If you had, I think you showed a tree in a courtyard, and we were looking at maybe what rooms I could see it from. And it's not just like in 2D, that would be like a trunk and a canopy line maybe, but in 3D, it's the actual shape of the tree, right? So you can see what you can see, you can understand what you can see from all these different locations. And you had the example of path of travel, and you could actually use it to traverse stairs, for example,
Right.
which is
Exactly.
very different than what I could understand in 2D. So I think that's kind of an interesting point about what the voxelization is enabling the designer to do, is just better understand what's happening in their project when it comes to these different kinds of studies.
Absolutely. And yeah, so the fact you can go up and down stairs because of the way that the voxels work, and you check the adjacency, but it can sort of go up a little bit. So you can actually sort of map how somebody would walk. It works a lot less well with elevators, of course, because that's like, that's harder, but you can build in the logic to sort of manage that. But yeah, so back to your question about the path of travel and sort of connecting with XR. I mean, I absolutely think that, I was always, back when the HoloLens came out, I was quite lucky enough to be able to get one quite early on of the first version of the HoloLens.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really intrigued about this possibility of within, some sort of XR device, in this case, the HoloLens, you could be given a path to walk through a space. And so at the time, I'd sort of, I didn't do any kind of automatic pathfinding, but I just drew the path inside an AutoCAD model, created the capability inside to AutoCAD to send that across to the HoloLens device. And then you would literally just see this sort of path snaking through the space, and you would travel, walk along that path. And what was kind of interesting is that because it's right there, even if there was smoke or something in the way, like if there was an accident, you could follow the path anyway.
Right.
And also had the device built in this sort of additional capability, because there is this like local scanning done by the HoloLens device. So I also built in this sort of fairly rudimentary capability of sort of rerouting locally around obstacles. So if somebody had, something had fallen inside the space and you couldn't get through, it would kind of try and go around it, and it would kind of, see whether it could. So it's kind of interesting for me. It was absolutely compelling in the sense that if you can imagine this sort of centralized path planning capability, maybe using VASA or something somewhere on a server in the cloud or wherever, but then, and then having this sort of more local capability to manage local conditions, I think there's definitely an opportunity to do something around XR, particularly around, emergency egress and, sort of emergency services. I can well imagine there being some really interesting potential around that in the future. But yeah,
and just to have this device in my pocket that I could pull out and use as an augmented reality device, or maybe it's paired with a headset or something to cue me via voice, or some kind of a cueing system that built into it, because if you can't see, maybe you need to hear it, or maybe there's I also can see a lot of applications in emergency situations, but also like in orientation situations when.
Right.
This episode is made possible with support from Confluence. Picture this: October 2019, Lexington, Kentucky, the birthplace of Confluence, a place where tech leaders, AEC product developers, and practitioners came together for 3 transformative days. It was more than a conference. It was a confluence of ideas, discussions, and unforgettable social experiences. Since then, over 200 attendees have experienced the magic of Confluence. I've had the privilege of being part of 3 of these remarkable gatherings, 2 in Kentucky and 1 in Orange County, each one a melting pot of learning, collaboration, and camaraderie around a topic shaping our industry. And now we're thrilled to announce the next regional Confluence event in April 2024 in the vibrant heart of New York City. This time, we dive deep into the realms of AI and machine learning, unraveling their mysteries and potentials in our industry. Are you interested in being part of this exciting journey? To continue the conversation, to shape the future? Visit the link in the show notes for more details. Confluence, where ideas flow, connections form, and the future of AEC technology is shaped, one conversation at a time. My thanks to Confluence for supporting this episode of the Troxel Podcast. And now, let's get back to the conversation.
So, but, just to sort of be clear, the purpose for building VASA in the first place was much more around just sort of assessing the quality of designs and how, once again, sort of using that as a tool for us to assess how well suited designs will be for their future occupants. So which kind of ties into my current main focus in terms of the area of research, which is around human-centric building design. So how do we capture the human experience inside the built environment? We can try and distill it down. We can try and build measures or metrics around how we expect people will experience a space. And how do we give those insights to building designers and architects during the design process to sort of say, well, these design changes you're making are going to influence the well-being of the people who eventually use the space, whether, positively or negatively, and help guide them through that in terms of, is there enough space in here for plants? Is there enough space for, socialization between people? Are you going to, have these interactions between people that are positive and that are good for their, good for the productivity of the company, but good for their personal well-being as well, because we're social animals, right? So
those kinds of metrics being informed by real people who can have those experiences during the design process to help the designer make decisions during the design process that ultimately serve the purpose. I think that's a huge shift that's happened in AEC technology over the last decade or two, right? Which is tools that used to be used at the end of a process are being incorporated earlier and earlier now to help make decisions along the way. And they're just part of the design process instead of an output at the end. I think that's, as a designer myself, I feel like as these tools come online, it gives the designer superpowers to really show the value of an architect in this case, right? Where I think a lot of times it's just intuitive. There's things that we've been trained to do. We understand that they will probably work the way that we think they will. And then it's only after the building is delivered that hypothesis actually gets tested, right? Every building is a prototype, is what a lot of people say, because it really is. It's got a different site. It's got different environmental conditions. It's got a different user group. The people who are occupying it are different. It's like all of these things stack up and it really is a hypothesis, and you can't test it until it's over. Well, that's not really the case anymore. If you're willing to include those people in the design process, which does change the design process, right? And it does change the way we approach delivering projects, which sometimes is set in stone. It's hard to change those kinds of things because our contracts are structured a certain way and our interactions are on these certain milestones on a calendar, but this real-time feedback mechanism with software and hardware enabled is really incredible if we're willing to harness those things to really, I guess, just really harness them and affect the outcome in different ways that we've never been able to do before. I think it's absolutely fascinating. New tools in the toolbox enabling us to do that.
No, absolutely. And it is really exciting because I think, and it's kind of, in some ways, it's a bit like what happened with software development in the sense we used to, with the waterfall method, we always used to sort of have these big projects and you deliver it at the end, give it to a customer and say, hey, what do you think? And they'd be like, well, not really what I expected.
Yeah.
But now, of course, with more, now for the last 20, 30 years. I don't even know how long it's been, but, effectively using agile processes where you engage much more with the customer along the way and you iterate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a little bit harder when you're talking about a physical environment, but things like XR, things like, getting that participant feedback and allowing them to play a role in the, in the design process is super valuable. And I see it just becoming really, really compelling as technology evolves.
And just using it as a method of communicating those ideas to somebody who can understand them in a much better way than they can a traditional method of like looking at a 2D plan and not knowing how to read a 2D plan, right? I can't tell you how many times I've sat with a client where they sign off on something on a 2D plan and then it happens in 3D, or it actually gets built depending on the process, and they're like, whoa, that is not what I thought. That is just because they don't speak that language, and these tools are helping us speak their language if we're willing to do that, right? And so renderings served that purpose for a long time, but renderings were so curated, right? We're going to do this angle, we have this field of view, we have perfect materials, perfect lighting, perfect reflections, and the real world is not perfect, and it could change on an hourly basis, the lighting, and it could change air quality and acoustics, and there's so many different things that affect how somebody experiences something in the real world that we can now potentially plug into these models earlier on and say, this is what we're talking, this is what your experience, this is as close as we can get to the real world experience before it's done, before we've spent all the money. And that's an incredible process to go through with a client, and to let them look around where they want to look and to experience things and watch them experience it, actually be in the room when they're experiencing it, because so much is communicated over facial expressions and body language. And like, you don't send this stuff over email. Like, you sit in the room with them, right? And you experience it with them to get their real-time feedback on many different levels, not just after they've convinced themselves that it will be okay, kind of a thing, right? It's that just visceral connection that you can have as an architect with a client. I keep going to that because that's my experience and that's what I'm most interested in. But I think that there's an amazing application possibility here for these tools. And to your point, it's early days, right? Like, this is the convergence of these different pieces of technology. It's still early days, right? But I think it's an incredibly important piece of research to be doing, because it actually makes potential outcomes so much more impactful for the people who actually pay for these services and these buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it sort of makes me think a little bit, we were talking about XR earlier and the potential for that. I mean, I remember when the first time I used Google Earth VR, right? So it was kind of cool. You were kind of like in this, you were huge. You weren't, human scale. You were like Godzilla or something. And but you walking through
my
space.
son, my same son, he's also obsessed with Godzilla, and we did that. We had the HTC Vive and there was what was it, Tilt Brush, and you could draw, right, and you could do all this. But then there was Google Earth that you could actually go in and change the scale of, and he always shrunk it down because he wanted to be Godzilla and he wanted to walk through the streets of San Francisco, right? That is an amazing experience to be able to have.
It was unbelievable. And then you could like grab the sun and drag it through the sky, right? To change the time of day. Right. And I'm just sort of thinking back to your point about experiencing something under different conditions. You can, it wasn't in there, but you could maybe just change the weather as well. Make it gray and miserable, right. Find a way to allow people to experience the building in all sorts of different conditions that otherwise they wouldn't. And I always, and on a kind of related note, I always felt the real opportunity around XR in a general sense was this, this ability to do things together with people rather than, the thing is, again, somewhat incongruent. It's this very isolating technology in many ways, right? You put this thing on your face and you sit there, but I think the real potential is like, having this shared experience with multiple people, perhaps it could be an architect, leading a family through what it's like to be in their new home and just making design changes on the fly as they give input. But having that kind of shared collaborative experience can all of a sudden take something that is kind of fundamentally isolating to being something that's really empowering and engaging. And that is where I was always very interested by the potential for XR, is not this, lock me away and let me play on my own on some video game for 10 hours, but more like, how do you sort of flip it around and make it this compelling experience? And I think that is, again, what, I'm sure Gabe and his team is focused on, and others as well. And so we're seeing sorts of technology coming out, from Apple and others. That's really exciting.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's lots of reasons to be optimistic that technology is looking to make certain things easier, I would say.
Yeah. So with VASA, what is that available for people to actually give it a try, to use it, to see how it works? And maybe you can explain where people can go to see examples and get the code and run it.
I think inside the Dynamo package manager, you can just sort of get it and download it. And I haven't tried it with Forma, but now that there's Dynamo for Forma, you should be able to use it there too. There's probably with Civil 3D as well. Not that I've tried that. But, definitely Dynamo for Revit. You can just, download it in the package manager. It's probably worth going. The best source of information for it at the moment is probably my blog. So if you go to keanw.com/VASA, VASA, then you'll find all the posts that I've posted related to that over the years, including some introductory videos from Reese that really explains exactly what's going on under the hood and why it works the way it does. I think that's probably a good place to start.
I'll put a link to that in the show notes for the episode, but could you give a kind of super short, truncated version of your class to just explain what it's actually like to use it? Because I think we've talked about it and maybe some of the potential use cases, but just give us a foundation of the user who might look at this toolkit and use it would experience as they run through it for the first time.
Sure. So typically, it is it's not probably it's worth pointing out that this is not a product as such. It's kind of like a library of functions, that exists somewhere in a DLL or whatever. But ultimately in Dynamo, it's surfaced as a set of nodes. So you drag your nodes across into your graph and connect them, and you'll have some processes where you might take, for example, import an STL file, and it'll create a voxel model of that STL file. And then from that voxel model, you've got various operations that you can perform to then analyze that voxel model. And then ultimately, at some point down the line, once you've done your various operations, and these operations can be chained together, right, in the sense that what's very interesting about VASA is we've got a very unified approach to creating analyses. So whether it's daylight or visibility or pathfinding, the output of each analysis is actually another voxel model. And so that voxel model could represent the path of voxels that go through a space. It could represent the shadow that's created by something, or it could create, decide what you're able to see. But each of those is, because it's this uniform format, the input's a voxel model, the output is a voxel model, you can start to chain together these operations in interesting ways. So you could, for example, analyze a space and do some sort of shortest path analysis, but also figure out not just the shortest path, but the one that has the most sunlight or the one that has the most shade, right? So you can start to think about how these analyses can work together. And then eventually you will have, from your voxel model, you'll choose to visualize it in some way at some point. So you can turn on, you could overlay the path that was a set, create found between 2 points in the overall model, you can then display that voxel model in the context of the original model, for example, so that you could see that path with a certain color going through the 3D environment. So was that clear enough?
Yeah, I think that well, I think it helps to have the visual as well.
Yeah.
But I think if somebody sets up their screen and they listen to the podcast at the same time, they could figure that out. I think what makes this so interesting, Kean, is that you can then start to think about what parameters you would want to plug into spaces to set up different constraints for the analysis engine. And I'm just thinking as a designer, like maybe there's an energy parameter of like the kinds of spaces and the types of energy or the types of uses that they would have. And so for this kind of experience, it would choose this kind of a path. And for a more private or a more quiet experience, it might choose a different path for me to get from here to there. I think that there's a lot of interesting potential, again, to kind of change what we put into our models as far as metadata goes, because it starts to inform the things we're interested in studying along the way throughout the design process that haven't inherently been in the system before, right? It's like, I'm sure that there's been some instances of that kind of a thing, like healthcare design with paint color and how it affects mental health. And there's definitely things like that we could always tag. But now to actually bring that back into kind of an analysis engine that we can just continually monitor throughout the design process and get updates and maybe get scorecards back or dashboards or just test it against an actual user to say, like, is this actually working? Is this telling us what we think it's telling us? I think that there's some interesting potential there to tweak the design process for better outcomes.
Yeah, I think this, and I don't know if this is really speaking to the same point, but I'm really interested by this idea of sort of following through on design intent and sort of understanding whether it really, is the design either going to, do you anticipate via simulation that this design is going to meet the design intent, or once it's actually been kind of realized using sensors, using computer vision, doing whatever, can you show that design intent was met in the real world? So I think having these sort of feedback loops was is really super interesting. And I think that sort of capturing that in some way along the way, because at the moment we don't, right? We just have, you'll model your space, and we may be able to infer some intent from the sequence of operations or the way it's been done or whatever, but it's never really made kind of explicit. And that's when we think about in the context of something like ChatGPT, where it's a dialogue, right? And you're sort of saying, layering in information, and you're sort of requesting additional, you've got this sort of history of requests, and the intent is kind of there as a dialogue. I think that that's really an interesting way that eventually over time we're going to be capturing all of the essence of what is intended, and then being able to come back and valid, figure out whether it was met in some way.
And back to your point of like this human layer of interaction and the validation that can occur throughout the design process, and how that can include the end users, or there's so many layers to who the end user might be, but actually plugging them into the process of what it takes not only to design this building, but get what they want out of it, and make them a part of the design process rather than the traditional black box design process, which is like, I'm going to go work over here in my office, and then I will present it to you when I'm ready, and then I will come back and I will make some changes, but to do that kind of out in the open, right? To do that transparently with them included creates a completely different experience for them along the way from nothing to the actual building. I think that human part of it, those stories are what is going to live on beyond me working on this project to me working on the next project, which is a completely different set of users. Like, those stories get to proliferate and again, kind of strengthen the story of what we do as an industry that actually serves people. And at the very, like the end of the day, that's what this is all about, right? And that to me, these tools give us the ability to do that even better and to really show the value of what it is that the AEC industry actually delivers when it comes to an architectural experience or different types of experiences that must be met. Like that validation feedback loop that can actually happen throughout the process is incredibly important and empowering as to fulfill the mission of this project.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't. Were you able to come by our booth at AU? We were in the far end, so we were kind of tucked away. But we had a stand called From Steps to Stories.
Okay.
So it's actually a project that we wanted to sort of showcase some work we did with an organization in Toronto called the Bentway. So I don't know if you're familiar with the city. The Gardner Expressway goes through downtown Toronto, and the sort of city of Toronto has redeveloped a lot of parkland space underneath this raised expressway and sort of repurposing it to make more of this sort of engaging community space. We've been talking to the Bentway for many years, and we saw this opportunity to sort of go in and try and effectively capture the human experience in this space. So we it looked a little bit, funny, but, basically took a construction helmet, put a 360 360-degree GoPro video camera on top. We had a boom with a selfie camera pointing back at the person's face, so we could start to get, capture what was on their face, not necessarily what they were feeling, but it give you some clues, right? As well as a number of other sensors, environmental sensors. We had the GPS from the GoPro as well. But we also gave them a smartphone, and every so often we'd ping them with a timer and say, "What now? You need to enter how you're feeling." And we sort of wanted to capture also this qualitative data alongside the quantitative data, so that we could really kind of get a sense for, well, first of all, could we have guessed how they were feeling based on what we could see from their face, or other factors? Is there some connection there, or and even anyway, it's all. You can imagine other sort of types of sensor as well, like with wearable smartwatches, and whether it's heart rate variability,
right?
Get that right, or galvanic skin response, or who knows what sort of things you could do to indicate stress levels and things. Anyway, we didn't do all that. We just sort of used visual feedback and then asked them how they were feeling. But we aggregated this huge data set effectively into an experience where people could go in and navigate this data. So we used computer vision on the video to sort of do what we call a segmentation of the scene. So we could color all the cars one color, we could color all the trees another color. So, and then you could actually sort of look at this map of the number of objects at each stage. So you could have kind of scrubbed through and say, well, I want to find this. I want to look at this part of the experience for this particular participant, because they seem to see a lot of trees at that point. I'm curious where they are. So you could really kind of enable people to explore this data in a really compelling user interface that kind of included the quantitative with the qualitative, and even you could see little speech bubbles with what they were saying at that particular moment, because they were talking as well into the smartphone. But again, so we created this sort of very interactive exhibit where we had, well, the first one in Toronto, we had like six 50 or 55 or 65 inch screens, placed vertically but next to each other, and that was this like huge visualization of the space, and you controlled it with a smaller touch screen that would effectively change everything on those screens. And at AU we didn't have as much space, so we just had 3 screens and then a smaller touch screen controlling them. But it was a way for people to kind of relive the experience of being in that space, or to get insights into how people experience the space. And we tried to get a diverse set of people, some who knew the Bentway, some who didn't, And then, basically would capture that data in order to, at some point in the future, you can imagine that data being very useful when redeveloping another area underneath a Bentway or elsewhere. And, so that was kind of the AU exhibit, but it's really like it's, looking at ways to involve people in process of sort of understanding how the built environment functions for them.
Yeah. Right.
And surfacing that in some way with the potential of it influencing the design process. So I think that kind of speaks to a little bit to what you were talking about. Yeah.
I think that's fascinating. I guess maybe we can wrap up. I have this particular point has really led me to want to ask you this last question, which is how important is the research arm of Autodesk? I mean, to you, but also like thinking of it big picture, because what I'm looking to get insight out of is how important is it for an AEC firm to have their own version of this as well, and what kinds of things, like you probably have a bigger budget than most AEC firms for R&D, but R&D is something that I think should be happening in all of AEC, and it's not, right? I mean, like it's happening in the large firms for sure. The budget number is probably still too small, but how important is it? Like I'm sure it's driving value, but I would love to hear it from you, why you think this is so important and what people could get out of doing R&D.
Yeah. So I think there is value in having, the large, it's interesting. I mean, going back far enough, I mean, Autodesk was always a fast follower, right? In terms of our business strategy. It was not necessarily to be the first to break ground or to do something significant. It was to, how can we democratize not existing technology, but take stuff that's like $100,000 and make it available for $10,000 or, that same sort of order of magnitude reduction in cost. So it was always about that democratization aspect. And so I think really that shifted when, under Carl Bass and Jeff Kowalski was CTO back in the day. And they really sort of, Jeff made the decision to sort of build out this research function. We'd acquired Alias in Toronto. So we already had this core of researchers that, served as the kind of seed for us to build out this larger organization. I think it's hard for me to put a number on how valuable it is, but I think that it's really important for large. I think it's really important for small companies that large companies like Autodesk are doing this work, because I just don't think they have the scope to do it, and it's
doing
going
it on their behalf.
Essentially, create. I mean, I know I don't want to. It sounds funny to say that, but at some level, yes. I mean, I think it's the big players. Of course, they have their own bespoke tool set and capabilities, and possibly don't have the incentives in place to actually make that better for the industry as a whole. Whereas, whereas it's self-interest, but yes, I mean, we have that interest to sort of extend our tool set to sort of enable these emerging workflows that otherwise would not be possible for smaller companies. So I think it's important. I do think that so I don't necessarily think that investing heavily as a small company in some very sort of esoteric researchy type thing that may or may not pay dividends. I don't think smaller companies have the sort of risk tolerance to do that in quite this way. So I wouldn't always recommend it. I think that in a general sense, I mean, and I would sort of separate this idea of research in the sense that we're looking at from having some programming capability in-house, right? Which I think is increasingly valuable for everybody. Everybody in the industry, I think if you don't have, well, not everybody, I think that it's becoming more important for people to have some fluency with customization and programming
Yeah.
technologies, and increasingly it'll extend to the use of AI and having fluency around that as well. I think those are the things that are really going to allow smaller companies to stay competitive and do more with less, I guess, in that sense.
Nimbleness,
so I think
right?
it is, yeah. I think that's important. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because it isn't available to everybody. Not everybody has the resources or the budget. Or resources could include people or hardware or software or time, right? To chase after that stuff. But so I appreciate you adding the perspective that the work that you're doing at some level is on behalf of those who don't have those resources, and so that's a really important point to make. I appreciate that. This has been a fun conversation. We've gone all over the place, and we've traveled the world. We've traveled through time, and it's been really fun to have. And I appreciate you taking the time to tell your story and the story of what you're working on today at Autodesk. And it's been great. I hope people enjoyed as much as I did. So I'll put links to everywhere people can find you on the internet, on LinkedIn, your website, your blog, the tools that you're working on with VASA, and your course at AU. I think it would be great for people to catch up on that as well. Is there anywhere else that you want to point people toward?
No, not off the top of my head, but if people want to connect on LinkedIn or on I don't post quite as much on X as I might once have, but I do still, all my blog content goes out through LinkedIn and Twitter or X as well. But yes, I'd just love to hear from people, reach out and get in touch. And thank you for inviting me. It was a very pleasant surprise. I love what you do, and it's been a pleasure coming on.
Well, thank you very much. And likewise, I look forward to, hopefully we can do this again in the future.
Yeah, I hope so. Definitely.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Evan.
Thanks to our sponsors, and thanks to our members this week. Find out how you can become a member at trxl.co. And I'll talk to you again next week.